Shalom. So, as Rabbi Bernhard explained earlier on in the service, our Torah portion this week is what's known as Sefer HaMishpatim, the Book of the Law, the first compilation of laws to be presented to the Israelite people after their exodus from Egypt. Can I just have a show of hands? How many attorneys in the room? Oh, come on, there must be some, all right, and me, or at least a recovering attorney, thank you. You may put your hands down. This is a very exciting Torah portion for us, I just want to say. So last week we heard the 10 utterances, more often known as the 10 commandments, but this week's laws are really much more specific. They cover both civil and criminal matters. They deal with setting up a judicial system. They deal with the whole spectrum of what happens when there's damage to property, looking after land, looking after the vulnerable, homicide, both intentional and unintentional, assault, battery, the taking of pledges and the returning of those pledges, as we heard, how to run the calendar, and there are more. I'm really only scratching the surface. So, here's my question. After the 10 utterances, people standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, Moses has gone up into the cloud to get the rest of the book. What is going to be the first law that is going to be taught to the people? If you were writing the book and you crack open the spine, what is the law that you would put as chapter 1 of how to set the ground rules and the base rock for the society that you're going to build? Think about it for a moment. And then notice that what the Torah gives us is, I think, extremely surprising as the first of the rules on which this new society is going to be based. I'm going to quote it for you. This is what it says. It says, "When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In his 7th year, he shall go free without payment. If he came single, he shall leave single. If he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she has borne him children, the wife and the children shall belong to the master, and he shall leave alone. But if the slave declares, 'I love my master, my wife, and my children, I do not wish to go free,' his master shall take him before the judges. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall then remain a slave for life." That's it. That's the first law in the book. That is the law upon which we are going to build the foundations of the society that we want to build. And we might feel, and I think we might feel it with some justification, that that is not the most auspicious of beginnings as these things go. Not least, we might feel, because God just said, this is the first of the utterances, that the people have been brought out of the house of bondage and the condition of slavery, so why begin with slaves? And not just, we might feel, this rather invidious situation in which a slave has an option to agree to be indentured for a lifetime, and we might feel not with the element of blackmail of, well, you can go free, but your wife and your children have to stay behind. What is this? What are we doing presenting somebody with such a choice? How is a law like that standing as the first law of the basis of what we would hope and expect to be a fair legal system? How does that law get to be first? And this is a good text for what I think of as the enterprise of Torah wrestling, because the Torah is capable of being transcendently sublime. We saw that last week at Sinai. But let's be honest, the Torah also presents us a number of times with scenarios like this one. And as my mother would say, not every day is Yom Tov. So what do we do with this material? What do we do with it as a Jewish people? What do we do with it as people who aspire, as I believe we do, towards a better society? And what do we do with our sensibilities? What are we supposed to make of this? Well, I think there's an important first step. We can start exploring. Obviously, my answer, I'm a rabbi, my answer is going to be that we have to read it at a deeper level. But I think even before we do that, we have to put our hands up and we have to say, we don't like this one. This one does not sit well with us. This one is challenging. This one is difficult. This is one that if it got left out of the final cut, let's be honest, we probably wouldn't miss. And I think we need to say all of that so that our encounter with the Torah can be free and open and honest. And if we don't say that, if we don't say that there are parts of Torah that make us uncomfortable, then we're missing a crucial first step. So let's just sit for a moment with our discomfort about that law. But as I sit with my own discomfort, and it's significant, as I imagine yours is too, I'm also reminded of an analogy that I was taught by the actor Anne Hearn-Tobolowsky. She comes sometimes to the Torah on Tuesday classes. And she pointed out that for us Jews, studying Torah is rather like playing Shakespeare is for an actor. If a line in Shakespeare doesn't seem to be playing right, the actor does not have the option to blame Shakespeare for writing a bad line. I mean, you can. It's natural and human that you would do so, but it's not ultimately going to get you very far to say, well, Shakespeare was just having an off day when he wrote that one. We don't blame the author. Instead, we try to deepen our relationship with the text and to see if there's a possibility of making the text more meaningful for us. And the traditional Jewish way of doing this is to borrow other people's spectacles. Yes? We have all of the medieval commentators. The whole enterprise is to enable us to read through the eyes and the learning and the sensibilities of some of the greatest minds of our tradition. In the traditional book, in the Mikraot Gedolot, the Bible with commentary that is the traditional Jewish way of reading Torah, we meet Rashi in 11th century France and his grandson Rabbi Shimon ben Meir, the Rashbam, and Abraham ibn Ezra, the 12th century wanderer through Spain and North Africa and Italy and France. He even lived in London for a while and also in Oxford. And Ramban, Nachmanides, the 13th century doctor and mystic, and we put on their spectacles and we say, okay, what do you make of this text? Well, certainly they read it deeply. So they move us from the surface and literal meaning of the text. Both Rashi and Rashbam deduce from texts found elsewhere in the Torah, reading them together, that we're not just talking about we're not just talking generically about Hebrews. We're not even talking generically about slaves. We're talking about a particular kind of slave. We're talking here about somebody who in his past life, prior to his enslavement, was a thief. And he was unable to repay what he stole. And so slavery is part of his sentence that was imposed on him by the court. And when we look again at that difficult law, we might feel, well, maybe this person brought it upon themselves. And if they brought their slavery upon themselves, well, it's actually rather kind of the Torah to offer them the possibility of emancipation after serving only a 6-year sentence, because a sentence for a substantial theft might well be longer. Can they help us, the commentators, with that difficult situation about the wife and the children? Well, says Rashi, the rule for an Israelite wife is the same as a rule for any other Israelite slave. In other words, if this slave was married to an Israelite wife, they would both go free. Therefore, deduces Rashi, the wife must be a wife from another nation, who the master gave to the slave. And Rashi doesn't pull punches. He adds, for the purpose of propagating children, to make more slaves. Ew. Not necessarily helpful to our modern sensibilities, but let's stash away that thought, that this is a marriage between an Israelite and a non-Israelite, because I want to come back to that thought later. And what about the piercing of the ear? The commentators say that if a slave is willing to give up the possibility of freedom, then they should be punished for abusing that gift. The commandments given at Mount Sinai, say the commentators, included the one that states that all of the Israelites are God's servants and only God's servants. And for a slave to prefer a human master over allowing themselves to be ruled by God, well, the ear that heard that commandment and opts out of it deserves to be punished. And the same kind of reasoning goes for the doorpost. The slave who is giving away his right to freedom must be taken not just to any old place to have his ear pierced, but to a doorway, to the place where God passed by on that night, that very night, as the Torah puts it, where the Israelites who were slaves became free. So it is right, goes the reasoning, for the slave to have his ear pierced if he wants to continue to serve a human master for life. And the message is a message of disapproval. Those are just some of the medieval interpretations. They're thoughtful, they're elegant, they read the text at a very deep level, and there are plenty more that I haven't cited for reasons of space. And yet, I think we have to be once again honest, and we have to say that just as we had difficulties with the text of the Torah, the distance between us and the medieval commentators is often so great that they still cannot rationalize a challenging text for us in a way that makes sense to our own lives. It's not their job to explain it. It's our job. It's our job to wrestle with these pieces of text so that we can decide in an informed manner whether there are things that we really cannot take, or whether perhaps there are things where there is more to them that with a bit of mental ingenuity, with a bit of careful reading, with a bit of deep thinking, we might not be able to learn. And I think there are 3 modern lessons sitting for us here in this difficult piece of Torah, if we take the time to read it. The first one to notice, and by the way, this was an irritating thing to discover at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon in a friend's Facebook feed. I discovered that a Hasidic rabbi wrote this sermon and wrote it better than I did. And furthermore, even more irritating is that this is a Hasidic rabbi whose book I do own, and which has been sitting on my shelf this year. It's just that I hadn't read him on this Torah portion, so I have only myself to kick. And for this thought, I have to give him the credit. It's really not my thought. We should notice that the legal system that is being created is designed to fit the society and the circumstances that existed at the time. And slavery was as commonplace in the ancient world as computers are in ours. Everybody who was anybody had a slave, just like everybody who is anybody gets a computer or an iPhone. And you can argue that it makes sense to begin your legal code with an experience that is shared by as many of the people you are legislating for as possible. So this is a society that is going to be grown into a world in which slavery is commonplace. And this is a society that is going to be grown out of a people who know from first-hand experience what slavery is and what slavery is like. And when you're building a law code, goes the argument, you begin at the bottom. You can only put the world right. You can only build a law code that is aspirational by beginning with what actually is. And the Ishbitzer Rebbe, that Hasidic rabbi who goes under the name of Mei HaShiloach, notices that the Hebrew letters in this first rule can be twiddled around. Hasidim like to twiddle things. Can be twiddled around to give us the idea that the world is possible of being perfected, but only if you start at the right point. And the right point for this code of law is the shared experience of what it is like to be a slave. Because if you're going to build a meaningful law for a society, the law has to be relevant. Irrelevant legal material doesn't work. That's point one. Law must be relevant. Second lesson is to notice that this is a law that presents a pretty radical reform. The idea that slavery, at least for this category of slaves, is to be temporary and not permanent is a radical innovation in the ancient Near East. And furthermore, the idea of a slave's rights, because that's what this is, the slave has a right to be emancipated in the 6th year. The idea that a slave has rights is an idea that is going to build and acquire layers and layers as the Torah progresses. What we have here is the first iteration of a law about slavery. There's another iteration in Leviticus. There's another iteration in the book of Deuteronomy, Devarim, and by then the language has changed, and the slave is referred to as your brother. Your brother who should not be your slave. Your brother who should be your equal. And from this, we get two more ideas about how a law code should work. It should be relevant, we already know, but it should not be afraid to reform, and it should be designed to evolve. Through case law, through precedent, through circumstance, a law should be flexible and a code should be able to breathe and to grow. It's the second lesson. And the third lesson is the most elusive, but to me the most fascinating. And it's to do with that issue of the wife and children that we parked before. And we remember here the commentator's idea that this is a marriage between someone who was born a Hebrew and someone who was not. And what we have here, I think, if we take the microscope to that relationship, if we look at the idea that the slave can reject his potential freedom because he loves his wife and children, we have, appropriately enough, we might think, for Valentine's Day, though it is not our simcha, we have the idea of love growing in the most unpromising of circumstances. We have that idea that love can spring up between a slave and the woman that the slave was forced to marry. And looking back to the text, the slave has to say not only I love my wife and children, but also I love my master. That in this relationship between master and servant, however unpromising the ground, just like, if you want, however unpromising we find this law as the first law of a law code, there is the possibility for love and loyalty and commitment to spring up. And if that love and loyalty and commitment has been created, then the slave stays loyal, even in the face of being offered the greatest of all gifts, even in the face of being offered his freedom. The slave gets to choose whether, prompted by love, he's going to stay where he is. So paradoxically, contained within that very difficult piece of text is a huge truth about free will. The slave is offered the very same freedom. Notice the tension, slavery and freedom. The slave is being offered the freedom to choose, the very same freedom that is offered to human beings right at the beginning of the Torah story. Even a slave, even somebody who is at the bottom of a social order, cannot be compelled to choose what the law dictates should be his choice. Yes, his choice is going to have consequences, of course, because choices always have consequences. But the choice is offered. And the idea that this new code is going to be founded on a basic idea of freedom and free will, well, that's an enormous idea. So, we've worked the text. I said at the outset that I wasn't comfortable with it. I'll be honest and say I'm not sure still that I am entirely comfortable with the text as a text, but I like what it teaches us. I like the reading. I like the fact that we worked with it and tried to glean something from it in terms of learning how a legal system can and should be set up. We have pragmatism. We begin with what we've got. We have reformation, because the law should be able to reform reality. We have evolution, because a legal system needs to be able to breathe and grow. And we have at the heart of that legal system the retention of human free will. Now, those are not bad principles to work from. And I think I can better justify that being the first law in the law book now. What the law doesn't take care of course, and what remains to be seen, is how those laws are going to be upheld. But that's another sermon, so I'm not going to be giving that right now. Shabbat Shalom.